Good old Edward the Confessor. Such a kind and holy man. So pious that he'll soon be named a saint, worshipped across Europe. Don't remember him for that? Understandable. He kind of ruined his reputation a bit, you see, when he, promised two people the throne. Nice one, eh? Greetings, it's winter here, and here's another video. So it's 1066, and the king's gone and left a bit of a bloody mess, to be honest with you. The Confessor, he's called, effectively being synonymous with the pious. Edward the Confessor has taken it upon himself to be chaste throughout his entire marriage, and because of it, now the fields of England have to be watered again with blood. Nice one, Ed. So now, there's 4 contenders for the throne. So let's start with the one which was the most Ed's fault. Mr. Harold Hardrada, King Harold III of Norway to you. Edward the Confessor didn't know or like Hardrada, and sure as hell hadn't promised him the throne. But because Ed had kind of stolen the whole thing from the previous King of Norway, Magnus, Hardrada felt sort of entitled to it. You see, Magnus the Good, the former King of Norway, had been promised the throne by Ed the Confessor's predecessor and brother King Harthacnut, when they both made each other their heirs. Succession in England, you see, and indeed the Nordic countries as well, was hardly a stable thing at the time. When King of England Aethelred the Unready had died, Canute the Great of Norway and Denmark at the time, taking it upon himself to invade England because he disagreed with the heir and had the might to take the throne from him. And when Canute died, his son Harthacnut had to land with an army to ensure his own brother didn't take it from him. Then, when Ed the Confessor took the English throne, Harthacnut made him king beforehand, before Harthacnut died, because he so feared a succession war. So they ruled as co-kings for a year. Before, Harthacnut perished suddenly, which some historians contest was poisoning, potentially by Ed the Confessor himself. Though it could have been a stroke from over-alcoholism, Holy Ed used a similar technique to assassinate the King of Wales about a decade later, which we know was him. Kind of a bit of a trend as a murderous guy. Nice one, Ed. As we mentioned, Magnus of Norway thought that the throne of England was promised to him instead of Ed, so he vowed to reunite the North Sea Empire or die. Before promptly falling off one of his ships, he was gathering for the invasion and drowning to death. Basically though, the point is, succession was hardly a surefire thing back then, and the fact that all English successions for the past 50 years leading up to 1066 had been militarily contested should tell us to expect more of the same for this one. Anyways, back to Hardrada. He was a hardened warrior with a massive tactical experience, having spent most of his life at war for the Byzantine Varangian Guard, and in his attempted conquest of Denmark and his campaign to consolidate control over Norway. He gathered himself a very large army at the time, of approximately 15,000 men, and with a fleet to rival the English's of 300 ships, he set sail for Northern England. Talking of Northern England, it's here that we're going to find the least known, perhaps aptly, and the mopiest of the claimants to the throne. Tostig Godwinson, Earl of Northumbria. He was younger brother to the other Godwinsons we're going to talk about, and really a bit of a fool. Having been exiled the previous year because he was so incompetent at stopping Scottish raids, King Edward thought it was on purpose, that he was actually trying to help the Scots, he decided to try his hand at claiming the throne. As you do when you fail to stop the Scots. Exiled in Flanders, his first action was to try and make an alliance with this Duke William guy in Normandy. But failing to do even that, he decided to take some loyal fellas and go and raid the northern coast of England. This, as with most things Tostig did, didn't really work out too well, with his own former citizens of Northumbria snitching on him when he turned up, the English navy catching and sinking his fleet, and his army deserting him once he was beaten by 2 local earls. With his tail between his legs, he fled up to Scotland, where King Malcolm III, who obviously also thought that he was on their side, let him try and gather a new invasion force. With few really inspired by his record of leadership, his attempts were going so poorly, he had perhaps his only good idea: sailing to Norway. Though this story is only told in sagas and has the embarrassing feature of maybe making Tostig look a little bit competent, he apparently arrived at and greatly impressed the Norwegian court, convincing a reluctant Harold Hardrada, who'd just been defeated by Denmark, to invade England. Whatever the truth of it is, though, from henceforth he stopped claiming the throne for himself and signed on to the invasion of Harold Hardrada. Great idea, right? Now for some actual guys. In the red corner was the most powerful man in England at the time, Harold Godwinson. And he had an actually very strong claim. Being King Deaded's brother-in-law, a relative of Canute the Great, and the son of Godwin, who had in effect provided the muscle that made King Edward king, Harold had the best blood claim in Europe, the English throne, alongside some serious might is right, being Earl of East Anglia and Wessex, effectively the southern and wealthiest third of England. Though whether Ed the Confessor had sent Harold Godwinson to swear fealty to Duke William of Normandy, or Harold's claim that the king promised him the throne on his death is disputed, it doesn't really matter, because at the time the King of England wasn't chosen by the outgoing one, but democratically elected by a council called the Wittenagemot, which translates to meeting of wise men in Old English. This council was a collection of the most important noblemen England had, and in 1066 they decided to make Harold Godwinson king. So, Harold Godwinson was the lawful heir to the throne. Yes, kind of. You see, while the Council of the Old Fuckers, while the Council of the Old Fuckers did have legal authority, and their selection of Harold does point to the idea that William was not sworn in as heir earlier, and that Harold did in fact get promised the throne by the outgoing Ed, there was a bit of back-scratching going on here. Now, I don't mean to discredit any democratic processes, but the Council of Old Fuckers was in fact a council of old fuckers. A great many of the council of old fuckers were in debt to Harold at the time. Several more were his close relatives, and the rest realised that a new Norwegian king, or a Norman one, meant that they were going to have to share some of their lands and privileges with foreigners. The coronation of Harold Godwinson took place the same day at Westminster, the 6th of January 1066, the suddenness of which, and the fact that all the nobles of the land were conveniently in the capital at the time, led the Normans to claim that this was a planned usurpation. And to be honest with you, I can see why. The story from the English at the time was that Ed the Confessor, who'd fallen into a coma, briefly regained consciousness to point to Harold and command the realm to protect him. Certainly, a story of the same kind would be treated with the utmost skepticism nowadays. However, by whatever means he claimed the throne, Harold did at least seem to be a good king. He was popular amongst the common folk, as much as that counts, and even the Norman chronicler said he was distinguished by his strength of body, his polished manners, his firmness of wit, and command of words, by a ready wit and a variety of excellent qualities. As we'll find out, he was also a bit of a badass warrior too. Finally, we have Duke William, known often at the time as William the Bastard. William being the illegitimate grandson of Ed the Confessor's maternal uncle, Richard II of Normandy, he had always seemed a sort of natural choice for Ed. Ed had spent his childhood in exile in Normandy, and when he finally became king, he had installed many Norman nobles to positions of high power within his court. Most notably, the Bishop of London, Robert of Jumiges, who had a large hand in writing what we know about 1066. Although to many in England, it seemed obvious that Harold Godwinson would succeed King Ed, in 1051 there was a major falling out between the two parties about who got to be most powerful bishop in England. Powerful bishop in England back then meant really powerful bishop of England. It's like the Pope of England, right? And the Pope, he's a powerful man, let me tell you. Instead, King Ed appointed Robert of Jumiges. Ultimately, after nearly facing an armed rebellion, the scuffle ended with the exile of the Godwins, during which time the theory goes that Ed attempted to appoint Duke William as his heir. However, the Godwins went on a trip to Jerusalem, came back with an army, and Ed, no longer so big and tough, let them back in, and after that, it was generally assumed that the heir was now again Harold Godwinson. William, however, had other ideas. A soldier all his life, Duke William had spent the majority of his reign quashing rebellion from his disloyal subjects, efforts he managed to wrap up 5 years prior to Ed the Confessor's death. Described by contemporaries as a pious, if not intellectual man, he was strong and talented fighter, and above all, he was loyal to those that showed the same loyalty to him, shown by his absolute faithfulness to his wife, which, as weird as it may sound, was very unusual back. Legitimately believing that Ed the Confessor had promised him the throne. About it, I'm not so sure. Harold Godwinson was nothing but a usurper and a fiat king to him, and immediately, upon Ed's death, set out his claim to take it. I'd say it has to be Harold. Even though Edward may not actually technically promised him the throne, and the whole and the whole woke up from a coma thing seems like complete bullshit. And even if it was true, is a king who's just woken up from a coma really in the state of mind to choose who runs his country next? He was both the legal choice of the Council of Old Fuckers and the closest male blood relative of King Ed. Even if you look at it from the modern perspective, from the position of the best man getting the job, based on merit and quality of character, Harold had been a senior member of the King's Council for decades. He knew how England was ruled, he knew how Ed had ruled England, he already had experience ruling a third of the country from his own estates, and was by even Norman accounts a strong leader, and was popular amongst the people of England. The same cannot be said for the foreigners who contested them. Discounting Tostig immediately for practically every reason there is to discount a claimant, I'd say Hardrada the next best claim, though it's pretty close because they're both not great. Harthacnut did promise Harold's cousin Magnus the Good the throne upon his death. As the closest blood relative of Magnus, and the fact that you could argue that Magnus has a better claim than Edward to the throne, you could go on to say that as Magnus's heir, Hardrada was the true king of England. Though I disagree with this, as Ed was sworn in by the Council of Old Fuckers and a brother to Harthacnut, and clearly his chosen heir, there's also a reasonable merit angle. Hardrada was of the same culture as most of the nobility in England, an experienced leader and warrior. Duke William the Bastard is last almost exactly for that reason. As a man whose own subjects in Normandy rejected him because of his illegitimacy, even if William was legitimate, his claim originates from a maternal grandfather, which is worse than Harold's brother-in-lawship to Ed and Canute the Great's descendants. While it's very possible that Ed the Confessor promised him the throne, Ed certainly didn't try very hard to force his vassals to accept William's claim. And it's equally possible that no such promise was made. Regardless, Ed was not the person who got to choose who succeeded him. The Council of Old Fuckers did, and they chose someone else. While in terms of merit, William certainly wasn't unqualified for the role, having 20 years of rulership under his belt and having successfully controlled his province despite major revolt within it. Both Harold Godwinson and Hardrada are equally merited, but he doesn't know England as well as Godwinson does, and that's a big factor. So then it was that on the 28th of September 1066, the man with the worst claim would land on the shores of Sussex. The worst claim and the future King of England. I hope it's as abrasive as fucking possible. Fucking leave me a comment saying make fucking more. Alright? Alright. Thank you. And I will see you next time.